It's common for us during the season of Advent, and then as we move into Christmas Eve, and also later on in our church year when we get to the season of Lent, and particularly throughout Holy Week, to hear the prophecy from Isaiah. It just resonates with us when we hear from Isaiah 9 on Christmas Eve. Earlier when we heard of Isaiah proclaiming that one who would come before him, who would come and baptize. And so much of that prophecy of Isaiah seems to get wrapped up around the events of Jesus coming or Jesus' birth and in the last portion of Jesus' life. But today, we again hear from Isaiah in a way that is a little less common for us to see and to hear. But as we look at the baptism of Jesus, and we see this prophecy from Isaiah that Michelle just read for us, there seems to be so many ways that things align. And Matthew, I think, goes to a little extra effort, a little extra words to remind us that Jesus truly is the one that the prophet Isaiah had been talking about all along. Just the way it starts out, here's my servant whom I uphold, my chosen, in whom my soul delights. That's how this 42nd chapter of Isaiah starts, and it's not hard to find parallels already when we hear that this will be God's chosen one and that God's heart will be delighted in this one. We hear as we move on about talking about the Lord who created the earth and gives it all breath. And when we think about that parallel of birth and baptism and giving of the Spirit and the breath that comes through all of that, it feels like so much resonates in here. And at the end of verse 6, Isaiah says, I've given you as a covenant to the people. And so as we talk through Advent and the Christmas season, we hold on to that promise, and that promise keeps coming back around to us, that great covenant that God made with God's people. And now all of that seems to be coming forth in the account that Matthew gives to us of Jesus' baptism. We talk about the heavens being open, God's Spirit descending, the voice, this is my Son, the beloved with whom I'm pleased. And it feels like all of this has come together. And that might be enough sometimes. But there's something else, I think, that's lurking in these passages. And that is of what God's great intention for all of this was in the first place. And we catch a few glimpses of that in Isaiah, and they're reinforced in this passage from Matthew. When we hear what God is doing with Jesus, we hear at verse 3 that this one who comes will not even break a bruised reed. That's how gentle of a spirit this person will have. A dimly burning wick he won't quench. That is, this person is not coming in like somebody with a big sickle that is tearing things down, or a flood that is drowning out things that he sees, but actually coming and caring for all of these aspects of life that need the most care. And in the midst of that, what will happen is God's chosen one will faithfully bring forth justice. And when we hear that in Isaiah, it's only a couple of verses later where we hear God say, I have called you in righteousness. And so often what we hear through these Old Testament prophecy is this sense of righteousness and this sense of justice. Well, they get intermingled. You really don't have one, or one does not have the purpose without the other. And so righteousness and justice are ways that the people have come to know what it is about God's ways and what it is that God is truly trying to accomplish in the world. And so when Jesus shows up at the Jordan River, and John says, whoa, I know how this works, because he's seen the way it worked with Elijah and Elisha. When Elijah is handing over the mantle of leadership to Elisha, he actually takes the yoke off of him and puts it on the next person. And John is totally prepared for that, completely ready to hand over that authority. But Jesus says, no, I need to be baptized by you, because in that way we will fulfill all righteousness. And again, you don't have righteousness unless you couple it with justice. And the two of them meet to create what it is that God is trying to accomplish in the world. And I think the reason Jesus needed to be baptized by John was so that we would understand that we're invited into that same baptism. We're invited into the same baptism where the righteousness of God becomes part of our mantle. We're invited into the same baptism where God says, "You are my child, my beloved one. I am so pleased with you." This is our baptism, and this is now our calling to understand that everything that the prophet talked about would not reside in one person, but the people who believed in that one person, the people who followed and loved that chosen one, would now take on the mantle of righteousness and justice themselves. And that is a part of our call now for this world. But we realize in the midst of that it gets confusing at times. We look around and we try to find out what is true righteousness, what is true justice. And it feels as if we get pulled in different directions trying to figure it all out. And we can talk to the neighbor who lives on one side of us, and they'll give us one side of the story. And we'll talk to the neighbor on the other side of us, and they'll give us another side of the story. And sometime through all of that, I think God is just begging us to listen more. That God is simply begging us to take on the mantle of righteousness, to live out a way of justice. But that does not happen when we think it's all on us. That does not happen when we are so convinced about ourselves that we stop listening to the world around us. And so part of what we see in that baptism is that the heavens were opened up and the Spirit of God descended on Jesus like a dove. Could there be anything more innocent? Could there be anything more vulnerable that could have alighted upon Jesus? It would be a completely different story if we heard that Jesus came up out of the water and then the tall grass on the bank spread and a lion burst forth and told Jesus to take charge and take command and to tear apart anybody that would ever disagree with him. But that is not God's way of righteousness. And that is not how God will execute justice. That will only happen when we decide to be the people who actually listen to each other. That we realize that when Isaiah was talking about this promise that was given was to be a light to the nations, to open the eyes that are blind, and probably not talking about physical blindness as much as God was talking about spiritual blindness, to set free the prisoners, those who lock ourselves away because we are so convinced we are right, we stop listening to the world around us, and those who sit in darkness. And we realize it is the people around us who might actually shed true light on the things that are happening in our world. But it becomes difficult because you know that it would be fraught with disaster for a pastor to stand up in the pulpit and even mention something like ice or oil, because as soon as that happens, you've already drawn a conclusion as to what this sermon is about. But the reality is, the sermon's about all of us. The sermon's about us actually taking time to listen to one another. To actually taking time to listen to God, to believe that God actually made a promise for the world. And so sometimes I have to listen to my neighbor, especially when I don't agree with them. And even if I don't think I'll ever be convinced they are right, they also heard these words at some point in their life. You are my beloved child, and with you I am well pleased. And if God would say that about them, then I have to listen. if God would count on their voice to be part of the big voice that will eventually bring righteousness, that will actually point us in a way of justice, then I have to listen to that voice. And I have to trust that voice will listen to me as well. And only when we choose to find a common voice, only when we choose to look at the world and realize that sometimes we can move in a place together that we would never get to on our own, that might be our only true path of righteousness, and is very likely the only way we will actually ever find justice. God's voice is still speaking. Sometimes it's speaking in the person I don't even agree with, but they've been given a voice, and God has told them how pleased God is with them. They deserve a conversation. And in the midst of that, Jesus is still speaking. In the midst of that, Jesus' voice does still break through. In the midst of that, God still promises us, this community and the communities around us, that God will be present. The heavens one day might open up and shed forth everything that we need to know, and we can stop trying to figure it out by ourselves. But in the meantime, we have our communities. In the meantime, we have our neighbors. In the meantime, we have a world in desperate need of righteousness. It is our only hope and our only path to justice. Amen.